for now, I'd like to hand over to Ms. Natasa Milic-Frayling. She is a member of the Preservation Subcommittee within the UNESCO Memory of the World Program, and she serves as chair of the Research and Technology Working Group for the UNESCO PERSIST project.
Thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be here and speak in the names of my colleagues who are part of the Preservation Subcommittee, part of the Memory of the World Program. The presentation will be focused on a complementary information that we heard this morning. We have heard about many initiatives that UNESCO has already underway to help increase responses to very well perceived, understood risk that we have to documentary heritage. I will be talking about the UNESCO work on the policies. Policies are absolutely critical to enable these sort of initiatives to be successful in the future, to be well supported by the national governments and international organizations. So I'm speaking, as I said, in a capacity of the Preservation Subcommittee, also a PERSIST project that is under the same subcommittee at the moment, and in a capacity as an expert in computer science and IT technologies. Just to give you first a brief overview of what we mean by documentary heritage and our practices in preservation. So we have already heard the importance of having past records and learning from past experiences. So documentary heritage is considered any resource, any information that we need to pass on to future generations. So that can be books in the libraries or documents in the archives, but equally so the modern technologies, databases, and content management systems that we are now using to collect information that we need. All of that, what is today, becomes a history tomorrow. So we are now talking about a really vast variety of documentary heritage. Now, we have seen that documentary heritage is important for disaster risk reduction, and because of that itself needs to be looked at very carefully. We need to understand how our methods in preserving documentary heritage also are subject to the risks that we are exposed to. So on both sides, on one side, documentary heritage enables us to be better in responding to risks, but it has its own inherent risks. So I will discuss this now first in the context of what we do when we do preservation. And this is an extremely simplified sort of workflow where we first identify what we want to preserve, then we engage in the preservation action. However, we often forget that preservation action is not one-off. We have already heard it has to be monitored, it has to be continuously maintained. And if we have just heard in the previous presentation, access to this preserved documentary heritage is absolutely key. Because only when we act on it, only then we complete the impact of our efforts to transfer the knowledge to future generations, present and the future generations, to respond to whatever we need to. So we are now already seeing that, I put here in a big blue rectangle, that while we are really working hard on the selection and preservation, we need to be ready for long-term commitments, because this is not an action, it is a process. And transferring knowledge for the future is for the future, and it is forever. So, all this is a daunting task. We now have made big progress, and I will now discuss what we have done so far. First of all, we have now experience, we have practices in place. And here I have simplified a discussion of the practices, just looking at 3 different types, because they have very distinct challenges. We have heard a lot about documentary heritage in a physical form, and those are different types of physical forms. We are talking about a different medium in which we store this information. The physical form, normally we subject either to conservation of original artifacts, so we have a manuscript, we then do our best to conserve it and preserve it in the original form. But then we also do digitization, because the digitization then is almost it's a backup, if you wish. It's a representation of the original that then we need to further maintain to pass to the future generations. Yeah? So digitization is one of the risk reduction strategy. Now we are still dealing with intangible cultural heritage, which has not been documented yet. So we need to be cognizant that we are now being reactive to kind of deterioration, aging, and a sort of risks of losing what we have in the form of languages, practices, customs in cultures that do not have physical artifacts that represent them. More and more we are using digital technologies to do that. So I just want to be kind of highlight this. And then, of course, then we have a born digital documentary heritage. This is what we have created for the past 50 years when we first adopted computing technologies in our everyday life. And that's accelerating rapidly. UNESCO already has guidelines for selection, for example, of a digital documentary heritage. They have been published and they have been disseminated in multiple languages. It came out of the PERSIST project as part of the preservation subcommittee now. And so we have made progress in practices. Now, our job now is to think about how to promote these practices at a global scale. And again, UNESCO in 2015 released recommendations. These recommendations for preserving documentary heritage in all forms, analog and digital. This document is extremely valuable, and this document is the foundation for our further work on policies. I will just now show you, if you look at the section 4 in that document, it already lays out very nicely the foundation in all aspects of preservation. Starting from the preservation practices, understanding what are the costs and how the long-term maintenance can be supported by the national governments, how we can optimize the cost and how we can, through partnership, achieve the capacity to act. All of that is already set up. On the right-hand side, you will see there is also information about legal frameworks, because even when we're preserving documentary heritage, those are maybe books, there are authors, there are copyright issues, there are retention issues. All of that needs to be put in place to enable libraries, archives, and museums and other memory institutions to act. Also important to encourage the partnership among the UNESCO organization so that they can complement activities, because documentary heritage is a fundamental part that informs the technology and science and education. So building on this, the question is, what we need to do next, and why are we now revisiting the policy and international agenda? Why are we seeking this international agenda? And the answer is simple. We are becoming faster in innovation. We have now a global scale economy. We are connected at the world level. And that has implications on what we see in the world around us, and how things are done and how we need to adjust our action for both the preservation of documentary heritage and our response to disasters. Yeah. So just for example, to highlight, we have so the speed at which the societal changes are manifesting themselves are also creating an urgency on us to act on preserving the cultures that are under danger, because we are seeing that there's more and more social phenomena that is passing and disappearing, and yet we need to be aware of the historical context in which certain phenomena happen. So we are being pressured because of this high speed of innovation and high speed of use of technology to rethink what our policies should look like. I should just emphasize that one biggest factor is the speed of innovation in technology, because every time we innovate and create new technology, we are suffering from obsolescence, meaning leaving behind the content that possibly cannot be accessed anymore. So all this kind of context encourages us now to think about how to formulate effective policies. And UNESCO has already taken the first big step, and that's understanding where our gaps are in existing policies. So in October last year, a UNESCO Memory of the World Secretariat and a Subcommittee for Preservation and Information for All project, we have come together to have a virtual dialogue and speak with practitioners about the issues they are facing and how we can then identify and build on the 2015 recommendation to put in place effective policies. So you will soon be able to read more about it, because the report is coming out, but we have identified 4 major areas in which we would first look at the gaps. And these 4 areas were technology, sustainability, culture, preservation action, primarily on the cultural identities that are at risks, and of course the legal frameworks that are required. And as I said, you will be able to read more about it. I'm just putting here in examples of several of these gaps that we have identified. Just as an illustration, even when you are successful in identifying and preserving and say digitizing documentary heritage or cultural heritage, you still then need to worry about the access. And one of the 2 key issues that we have identified, that you have to be cognizant of the participants who are providing information that we created the digital documentary heritage about, and think about their rights for access, to control the access, or the data sovereignty, and also protecting the access from unwanted access or digital trespassing that has not been given such an importance in the past. In the final part of my presentation, I'd just like to highlight a couple of things that are critical for our current discussion about disaster risk reduction, and is related to our practices. So digitalization is one aspect that, of course, is already accepted as a way for us to preserve the documentary heritage, but we are aware from our everyday experiences that digital is also subject to risks that unfortunately are not necessarily in the expertise or capacity of memory institutions to handle. We have already heard called for help because digital requires a specific expertise, and that expertise needs to be accumulated in collaboration with others. I just want to highlight here unique aspects of digital that we must take into account. And one is that digital content, whether it is digitized or whether it is about born digital, cannot be accessed unless we have software that's compatible to read it. So we are immediately talking about a long-term maintenance of enabling reading capacity, or we call them readers or software. Now, once you think about the software and software preservation, many memory institutions are already actively engaged in understanding what it means maintaining long-term software. We're immediately getting into problem with legacy operating systems, insecurity of the operating systems, and licenses so that we can actually use this software for preservation purposes. And of course, then we have to remember how to use it. Again, in the previous presentation, we heard about how important it is to have access to data, to remember what happened in the past. Well, equally, we need to be able to remember how to use the software that we have used when we've done documentary heritage capture and preservation. So I would just like to close then with one final reflection on what it means for the disaster risk recovery in the context of our preservation practices. If we are truly committed that a digital medium will be the way that we will preserve whatever is in the physical form and make it accessible for the future, and then if we also commit to preserving documentary heritage that is already in a digital form, we really need to work with experts that have created the digital technologies that we are using. So I would just urge everybody to make sure that there is a good connection in all your projects and initiatives with the ICT experts, with the ICT industry, and whether we are talking about commercial producers of technologies, open source community, or researchers in academic institutions, they need to be around the table because they need to advise on what are the best ways to make sure that the digital lasts. They will also know what are the best ways to protect, because we are constantly fighting cyber attacks. So there are lots of practices already in place. So for the future, I would just say that both the policy and the action really calls for a global collaboration across sectors to address this global issue. Thank you.
Thank you as well. That concludes our first session. We are a little bit behind schedule, but I would like to just address 2 questions that came up in the chat that I do find important, briefly to address these questions. And one is for His Excellency, the Minister Martina, which I would like to pose on behalf of the participant in the chat from Jajang Nurjaman, who asks, what does archives decolonization mean? Does it simply mean archives repatriation?
Thank you very much for the question. Yes, repatriation to the source countries on basis of restoring provenance. That's what it means. That is what it means.
Okay, indeed. Thank you for addressing that question for us, Your Excellency. And we have one final question before we break, and this one is posed to Ms. Frayling, who just presented. And this question comes from our chat and asks, what are the risks of digital management of archives? How can we fight against digital obsolescence?
Yes, I would be very pleased to reflect on this. The digital obsolescence is something that we live with and we'll have to continue to live with it, because digital obsolescence is the consequence of innovation. So we will not be able to stop innovation. We don't want to stop innovation. The innovation is coming now in the digital form. So all we do now is determine the best practices and action, so that our efforts on preservation is also constantly mirrored by our actions on long-term maintenance.
Thank you, Ms. Frayling, for addressing that question. And we, as I said, will continue to gather your questions and address them a little bit later in the day.